to follow along, the virtual folks, on your laptop through the chat. We also have a sign language interpreter available. We have translation to Spanish, and we also have closed captioning. Okay. Next slide. Next. So Dr. Wright and Ms. Zogby will give some introductions. We also have one person who has signed up for public comment, so we will have public comment. We'll very quickly just do a recap, summarize our last, 3 meetings we've had so far. We have a great expert presentation today. And we'll also introduce you to Mr. Nate Levinson, who is a consultant who will be working with this work group to help us move the work along, identify recommendations, get us talking. You know, we acknowledge the feedback from the group to get doing the work. So we're excited about that. And then we'll talk about future meetings and next steps. Okay. So with that said, I will turn it over to Dr. Wright and Liz to give some brief welcome and introductions.
Well, just to say thank you very much for being here. Well, what? So you told me not to turn it off,
Yeah,
so
but
I
get
haven't
really
touched
close.
it.
Get really close.
This
you
cafeteria
go.
this cafeteria voice that I've got to get close. Well, let me start over again. Let me just thank everybody for being here and for being troopers to come out on such a cold day too. We're excited about the work, excited about the progress, and anxious to hear what everybody has to say. Been meeting with a couple of folks in between our meetings, and so that's always very helpful to me to get some additional insight. But just really excited for the possibilities of what this group can produce for our students with disabilities. So thank you for coming. Liz?
So glad to be back. I want to keep it really brief just to say, because I know we're eager to get talking with one another. And, you know, I just want to emphasize how important it is for folks to continue to put your thoughts in writing, send them in. Hopefully today we're going to spend a lot of time interacting, hopefully with people who have different perspectives, so that we can really have some exchange of ideas and push, you know, some creative tension to kind of move things forward, and that we will get to the process of really getting recommendations on the table, recommendations approved and moving forward, and the work really started. So, you know, students with disabilities are counting on us, and I appreciate everyone being here and going through all the ups and downs and challenges of it. So thanks.
So we do have one registered guest for public comment. We ask that you unmute when we ask you to speak. We will monitor the time to 3 minutes per speaker, and when your time expires, I will just notify you that the time has expired, and I ask that that you finish your sentence, but certainly don't continue going on. So Miss Stein, are you there?
I am.
Great, you have the floor.
Okay. Hi. I am Melissa Stein, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Montgomery County Council of PTAs, the MCC PTA. I have 3 autistic kids who are served across the continuum of special education services. I'm also a special education teacher and certified autism specialist. I'm going to address today's guiding question in 2 parts. The first clause of the question reads, how can general and special education be more effectively integrated so that the instruction and built-in supports in general education can better meet the needs of students? My response to that question is a question. Are special education teachers located in local schools trained to support students with autism or with emotional disabilities? In my experience as a teacher and parent, and knowing the academic content and testing requirements for certification, the answer is no. Generic special ed certification does not require meaningful understanding of autism or of emotional disabilities. Asking how general and special education teachers can be more effectively integrated presupposes that special educators in every school can. Until teachers in local schools are trained to help our children on the spectrum, students can only receive an appropriate education in settings outside of their locally assigned school. In our county, this manifests as inequitable access to appropriate services. Programs are only known to parents like me who have the education, resources, and yes, entitlement to understand their child's rights to a continuum of placements. The second clause of today's guiding question prioritizes reducing identifications and referrals. I have to ask, does that really prioritize our children? What if we separate the two clauses? What if we ask how schools can reduce the number of crises that are traumatic for the student and their peers and contribute to staff burnout? Widespread classroom teacher and paraeducator crisis prevention and de-escalation training has been identified by the MCC PTA as a 2023-2024 policy priority. I repeat, widespread classroom teacher and paraeducator crisis prevention and de-escalation training is a priority for the MCC PTA. Trained staff can support students who struggle with emotional dysregulation before their behavior requires a crisis intervention team, and before students predisposed to emotional disabilities enter that cycle that limits their access to post-secondary success. I hope you consider this testimony, and I hope that you address this need for training to support our students. We believe these steps are necessary for realizing any plan for meaningful improvement in special education towards equitable access to post-secondary education and employment, the stated purpose of both the Maryland Blueprint and the Individuals with Disabilities Act. Thank you.
Thank you.
That is time. Thank you so much.
Okay, I neglected to introduce Dr. Hickman. I know he sent out a welcome letter to all of you, but I just wanted to have him wave and say hello to everybody, put his face in. He has joined us. We're super excited. Assistant Superintendent of here at MSDE, supporting students with disabilities. So thank you, Dr. Hickman, for joining us. Just a quick recap of the last meetings that we've had. Just in terms of our guiding questions, we've talked about the state of students with disabilities in Maryland, overcoming persistent barriers to effective implementation for students with disabilities. We also talked about existing standards and expectations under IDEA and ensuring that goals are set that are appropriate but also ambitious, right? And then we also talked about just making sure that the goals are aligned to the needs of the students. Then for overlapping meeting number 3 and today's meeting as well, looking at how can general and special education be more effectively integrated so that the instruction and built-in supports in the general education classrooms can better meet the needs of students, resulting in fewer referrals and identification. So that's just a quick summary of what we've talked about. We also wanted to mention and recognize some of the feedback that the work group has been sharing, which has been really good, in terms of the topics and how we've come to some of the topics that will change over time, right? Depending on how the group's feedback is, our conversations, the topics, we can shift the topics. But what Liz Zogby was great in helping us to do is from a variety of listening sessions that happened prior to the work group, there was a lot of feedback around what are the issues we need to tackle, right? What's important? And so Liz helped to generate some of those topics and also helped identify who are the experts that we could be reaching out to participate in these meetings to speak to some of those topics as well, and how could we sort of calendar those out. So that's sort of where those topics came about, but can be changed over time as we continue to have these discussions. And if anyone in the work group has ideas about experts, topics, absolutely, please make sure you share amongst this work group, amongst the chairs, so that we can make sure that those are incorporated as well. We also, you'll get to meet Nate Levinson, who I mentioned briefly earlier. Wealth of experience in working with work groups, large school systems on how do we do some of the work that's already been outlined and some of the recommendations put forward. But what Nate is going to help us to do is facilitate some deeper conversations around the recommendations that have been put forth thus far, helping us to get into smaller work groups to really dig in and talk about what would those recommendations look like, sound like in practice, get more into the weeds, and Dr. Hickman will help facilitate some of those discussions. So Nate will talk a little bit more about that, and also he's going to be able to help us with the structure of these meetings moving forward, again, listening to some of the feedback. How do we make sure that these meetings, not only that when we're together, but when we're not together, we're maximizing everyone's time. So we're looking forward to that. The work group at the last meeting had also talked about more information about where special education is situated in the LEAs. And so the team at MSD has already been started to work on that. So we're prepared to share that. They've started to do some outreach to the LEAs. They're putting information together that they'll be pushing out so that we can circle back with the work group to provide a summary of where the LEAs, where the special education offices are situated across the LEAs. That is something that came up at the last work group. And then also, hopefully, you've seen some of the working papers, the white papers that Buzzy has drafted and shared with the work group. Just want to make sure you have access and are reading those, because that's where some of the recommendations thus far have come from that we think are worthy of the work group considering moving forward. So we just wanted to acknowledge that and acknowledge that we hear you, and we want to make sure that we're addressing that as we move forward. Okay. All right. With that, I will turn it over to Liz. You want to introduce our first speaker?
Sure.
Yeah. Is Rebecca on?
Okay, so we are very pleased to have Rebecca Zumeta Edmonds with us today. She's a managing researcher at AIR in DC and serves as the co-director of the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and is really an expert in MTSS and particularly in thinking about Tier 3 interventions. So we are very glad to have her join us today, and take it away, Dr. Edmonds.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, I was coming from an out of office meeting today, and when I plug back into my laptop, sometimes the headphones don't acknowledge that they are still my microphones. I'm glad everything is working. Thank you for having me today. As Liz mentioned, I'm based at the American Institutes for Research. I live in Bethesda, Maryland, so I'm very personally interested in the conversations that are going on with the Blueprint group. I'm a parent of kids ages 2 to 19. I have 2 stepchildren and 3 young children of my own that are I like to call my bio babies, and so they. I'm very interested and curious to see how the state of Maryland is preparing to continue to support children in the state, and so I'm both interested from a professional perspective, but also a personal one as well. I do serve as the director of the National Center on Intensive Intervention, which is funded by the Office of Special Education Programs, and I think that's an important connection because there are often misperceptions about MTSS and the relationship between MTSS and special education. And so I just want to start my comments today by reminding all of us that actually a lot of the research underpinning MTSS models and the funding and support from it that's coming from the federal level has actually come from the Office of Special Education Programs. And for that reason, we should, I believe, be really thinking about how this is a framework that can and should be supporting all students in a school and not just a particular slice of students. So today I will be talking briefly about just kind of a high-level overview of MTSS. I know many of you are probably already pretty familiar with the concepts, but just as a kind of level setting for our work and for our conversation and the way that our center thinks about this work. We also, I should say, have a center at the American Institutes for Research focused on MTSS, and I serve as an advisor to that center. And again, there's a lot of overlap between the work of these two national centers. The Center on MTSS really thinks broadly about the kind of tiers throughout the continuum, whereas the Center on Intensive Intervention, where I spend most of my time, is really focused on what do you do at that most intensive level when kids have not responded to initial efforts at remediation or intervention support. And then we'll move into some considerations as you're thinking about how to support implementation at the state level. There are a variety of things that people who are providing these supports at the school, LEA, and state level can and should be thinking about, and that can be very different depending on kind of where you sit in that continuum. So I will offer some suggestions for things to think about after having worked for over 10 years and helping states and localities implement MTSS or components of MTSS. And then we'll wrap up with the guiding questions for the group. I will be able to stay till about 5:30. So if there are things that I can answer or parts of the discussion I can help provide any context for, I'm more than happy to do that. Next slide. So I just want to start my comments today with this notion that there isn't going to be a single teacher, a single time, a single skill that is going to meet everyone's needs all the time in all places. And so with that in mind, we really need a framework that can help us think about how to organize our resources and use appropriate and validated data sources to help to make decisions about what needs are, how to allocate resources, and where we may need to be making adjustments. And that's really what MTSS is designed to help us do. Next slide. So again, as I noted, I would really encourage the group to be thinking of MTSS as a framework that is an integration of data, instruction, and intervention that are intended to help maximize student outcomes in terms of academic achievement, social, emotional, and behavioral needs, on-time graduation, and other valued outcomes that the school system may have identified. It helps us, again, think about how to allocate and adjust our resources to get where we want to be headed. So, if somebody says, is MTSS going to fix all of our problems? I would say by itself, probably not, because it's a framework for really how to think about and address and solve problems. It's not necessarily the solution to the problem by itself. Next slide. For some historical context, some of you may be aware of the positive behavior intervention and support movement. Others of you may be aware of response to intervention. MTSS has really grown to be an umbrella term that encompasses a variety of efforts at providing tiered supports around different areas of need, and is intended to help you think about how to address the needs of the entire student. As you can imagine, if you have a behavior support team that meets on one side of the building and an academic support team that meets on another side of the building, they very often could be talking about the same child, but different issues that are happening for that child. And where if those teams were to get together and really be thinking about the student rather than the academic issue isolated from the behavioral issue, you may actually be able to solve a lot more problems a lot more efficiently and provide better supports to the student. Similarly, from a systemic perspective, by looking at those data and those patterns as a group that is working together, maybe I am able to identify trends and patterns in how behavior supports and or academic supports are being rolled out in the school that may be unintentionally creating challenges, or ways that those things could be used together to provide better supports and promote the outcomes that all of us want as adults in a building. It's intended to be a really data-driven and information-rich culture, so that we are collecting information that is relevant to the student, and relevant to the system, that assessments are validated, meaning that they have evidence of reliability, validity, and other technical features that mean that they are telling us something that is important to know about predicting future outcomes or potential needs that students or systems may have. And then it's also, as I've alluded to, a framework that can be really systemic at helping you look at high-level issues in a school or a school system, or within a particular content area or set of content areas. But it can also be a way to drill down for an individual student to determine, is the intervention program or specially designed instructional program for this student achieving the desired outcomes? If it's not, what do we need to be doing differently? And how can we be making educated and informed decisions about how to make those changes and do them in a timely manner so that we can promote the best outcomes possible for an individual student? Next slide, please. So I really like this slide, and this was developed by George Sagai, who was one of the initial directors of the PBIS Center. And I like it because it really gets at this notion of a three-tiered system, but one that is really intended to help students across a variety of content areas and needs. And we know that for many students, they're not always a student who is what we might call green, or who is across the board successful in the core program, or who is always needing an intervention, or always needing a particularly intensive or individualized intervention. That students often, have different strengths and challenges. And so we wanted to think about our systems so that they can acknowledge that and provide students the support they need at the level of intensity that they need, given the different particular content area or social, emotional, or behavioral support area of need. And similarly with that, we would argue that MTSS, again, is thinking about all students. So we're not talking about kids who are tier 2 kids, or that's a special ed kid, or we're going to the RTI room or the MTSS room. Really, this is a framework for, again, thinking about how to design the supports for students across these areas in the most efficient and data-driven way that we can, while also realizing that students present with different strengths and challenges. Next slide. And as many of you are probably familiar, we have our triangle that really addresses a continuum of tiers. You'll see states that sometimes articulate more tiers than 3. You'll see some who are even suggesting that 3 tiers is really difficult for a lot of schools to implement and fully conceptualize. So some have even started advocating for 2 tiers. At this stage, we talk about a 3-tiered model, and that is the most common model that you will see. And at a very high level, the notion is that tier 1 is the universal prevention system, or the core program that all students receive, and that in general, most students have their needs met in that universal or core level of prevention. People will talk about an 80% number. I would say that you might think of that as a sort of a target. You can absolutely imagine schools where 80% of kids do not have their academic needs met solely in the core program for a variety of reasons. And so it may not be that a school looks exactly like this when we start, but that this is sort of where we're moving toward in terms of what we're looking for as a system of supports within a school program. At the secondary level, you have kids who have been identified as potentially needing some additional intervention support in order to make progress. Typically, that's some kind of a standardized intervention program. Often 10 to 15% of students that fall into that level of need. And then intensive intervention, which is a much more individualized program, would be more in the neighborhood of 3 to 5% of students. So that is the students for whom the core program and the initial efforts at intervention have been insufficient, and the data are suggesting they really need something more involved and more individualized in order to make progress toward the outcomes that we've chosen to prioritize, whether it's reading outcomes, graduation, mathematics, social behavioral, or some broader collection of those. Next slide, please. So why do we think about MTSS? And the reason is because it is at its core, it is a framework for organizing research-based intervention and instructional approaches and programs with validated assessments to help school teams and teachers and educators make more informed decisions about students, to identify students who may need additional assistance sooner, to intervene in a timely way. And if and when we figure out those interventions are not providing the supports that are necessary, that we make changes to those interventions so that the students don't languish in an intervention or in a classroom where they're not having their needs met. We see across the board in controlled research, increases in instructional planning, reduced referrals and suspensions, increased on-time graduation, improved academic outcomes. I appreciated the comment from Melissa Stein earlier about trying to reduce placement rates in special education, and I think that's really important because I think what we're MTSS is really about making sure that the core program and appropriate and inappropriate instruction are not the reasons kids are getting referred, but rather that we are identifying kids for whom they have individualized and unique instructional needs that are not being addressed in the core program and they need something else, but not that the reason for their difficulties is due to what we might call students being a casualty of inadequate instruction. So I absolutely agree that special ed referral and placement of special ed services are critical and should be a part of an MTSS program and what we want for all schools and that full continuum of services. But we also want to make sure that we're identifying students appropriately and getting them placed along that continuum of services based on their needs. Next step. I'm sorry, next slide. So the 4 essential components are screening. So having some kind of a systematic and validated process for students who may be at risk for some kind of poor learning or school-based outcome. The next one is a multi-level prevention system. So that those are those 3 tiers I alluded to. Again, you may see some variation across states and districts that are implementing MTSS models. The third component is progress monitoring. So this is, again, use of valid and reliable data to assess students' progress toward goals that have been set using, again, validated procedures so that we know that they are working toward ambitious goals and that if they are not making progress toward those goals, we can make changes in a timely manner, that we are not letting them languish for 3, 6 months or even a year before we go in and do something about the fact that they may be continuing to struggle. And then finally, it's the database decision-making component. So as you can imagine, if you have screening and progress monitoring assessment data, you can be looking at a high level systemically with your screening data at how the system is functioning and the number of children who may need additional supports at a system level. And then the progress monitoring data can really help you drill in and understand for individual groups of students or individual students what their more focused instructional needs might be. And that can help school systems determine where they may need to spend more or less resources, how they may need to allocate teacher time, instructional supports, and so forth. And in addition, also may inform when and how to identify a student with a disability and to make that referral for an evaluation. So the characteristics, and I know I don't have unlimited time, so I'm going to probably move through this relatively quickly, but the slide is often helpful for kind of orienting people to think about sort of what the differences between the tiers might look like in terms of how instruction is designed, the size of the group, how often it meets, how progress monitoring is conducted, and so forth. You may see some variation based on whether this is an academically focused intervention, whether it's a social behaviorally focused intervention, whether it's looking at early warning systems or dropout prevention, but this gives you a kind of at least a high level sense of the way this continuum might look across the tiers. I would note that students with disabilities can and should be served across these tiers as is appropriate for their level of need, and again should be served within along the continuum of services that is appropriate based on what the IEP team has decides. Next slide, please. So I also want to kind of wrap up this section on talking about MTSS to just really reinforce the notion that there's a lot of training that goes into helping teachers and school teams understand the technical components and the instructional needs of an MTSS system. So what are the assessment tools? How often should I be taking data? How do I know when to make an instructional change? What are the intervention needs, or how should I be teaching reading to a kid who might be struggling, or what are the behavioral supports I could be providing? So there's absolutely that technical component, and I think that there are a lot of ways to approach that training. For the state level, I think a big piece is the infrastructure and making sure that you have the supportive policies and leadership that make it possible for that training to happen and for teachers to then turn around and use it in their work so that they're not going to a PD session saying, oh yeah, that's all fine and good, but in my district, we're not allowed to take data that way, or we don't have enough time because we have to give these other 10 assessments, or I have so many kids in my class that I can't think about doing this kind of individualization for 2 kids. So how do we think about those policies and supports that might be needed to create the conditions where it's possible to actually do MTSS the way we would hope? And then finally, how are we tracking our implementation? So we say we're going to do these things, but are we doing them? Who was responsible for implementation of different components? And how can we check to make sure we're accomplishing what we wanted to? And if we didn't, what do we need to change to make those things happen? Next slide, please. So as you think about endeavoring into MTSS implementation, I have a few things that I would suggest for states that are wanting to provide some supports to their local districts and schools. And again, I think that some of these things may vary depending on the level of the system where you're working, but this comes from over a decade of work with states helping them think about how to do this and what seems to work and not work as well for states attempting to support implementation. So the first is just this notion that all means all. It can be popular within an MTSS system to want to exclude certain groups of students who we think we won't perform well on a screening instrument, so we're going to leave them out of the screening assessment. Well, if you take them out of your overall N for your school, if you take your very low achieving kids or your kids who don't speak English or your kids with significant disabilities out of your screening system, suddenly those percentages of kids who look like they may or may not be on track to be meeting grade level expectations may look very skewed. And so as a result, you may be making decisions about resource allocation and other things based on flawed data. So I would just make very clear that we should be thinking about all students from the beginning. That means that students with disabilities should be able to access core instruction and intervention services in alignment with their IEP. So it is not uncommon for schools or districts to have de facto policies that say, well, if you have an IEP, you can't get intensive intervention because you're getting special ed. But in reality, if the service that they need is comprised within that intensive intervention, then they can and should be able to access it. So we really should be thinking about how to make it clear that these are systems that can and should be working together and not in isolation. We want to clarify the ways in which MTSS data could be used to inform eligibility for special education or a referral for an evaluation. Also, guidance about how state and federal funds could be used to support implementation. So that means the use of Title I funds, IDEA funds, coordinated early intervening services, and other data and other funding sources. And again, with the idea that if these things can be used and together to support implementation, they're not seen as disparate streams of work that have to be sort of checked off and where the requirements need to be met, but rather they're things that are helping roll up to a larger goal that MTSS would hopefully be helping to create the structure to make possible. And then finally, the notion that MTSS can be a lever for promoting more equitable outcomes across groups of students. Because if you're collecting data on all students, you can look at trends within particular groups of students or groups of students who may or may not be responding as well to the core program, and why might that be, and how could we be providing better supports at the core level to ensure that fewer children are needing intervention services because they're getting what they're needing in the core, or if we're finding a lot of students are being referred for needing some kind of behavioral supports, how can we think more proactively about getting teachers and others in the building the training and support they need to prevent those things from escalating. And when they do escalate, providing the training and support so that teachers know what to do in those situations. And it's not an automatic trip to the principal's office or suspension or expulsion, but rather there are some tools in the toolbox for people understanding what they might do. Recommendation number 2, next slide, is just to keep it simple. MTSS can feel complex and feel overwhelming quickly. So I would suggest thinking about identifying priority areas for initial implementation and really starting the work there and then expanding over time. Remembering that MTSS is a framework for comprising and components and organizing resources, and it's not, again, a single program place assessment service. There's no MTSS room in a school, right? You're not trying a particular reading program and seeing it does or doesn't work and then saying MTSS doesn't work, but rather it's a framework for how to think about the interventions and assessments and other supports in a system, and how to allocate those to get the outcomes that you may be desiring. We want to wrap up in 2 minutes. Yes, I can do that. Recommendation number 3 is to think about how to leverage existing initiatives and funding streams. I've alluded to this a little bit already, but some examples: the OSEP State Personnel Development Program is very aligned to MTSS and would be a really great entry point for thinking about how to provide supports at the state level, providing training or TA opportunities and so forth. Similarly, the State Systemic Improvement Plan, which in Maryland I know is focused on mathematics, can also be another opportunity for this kind of leverage point. Other things that we often see, things like dyslexia legislation, school improvement plans, early warning systems, school violence and mental health prevention efforts, and so forth. So again, to the extent that these things are seen as working in concert with one another, I think they are, it makes it more possible for people to see themselves in the work and the ways that can help them achieve what they want. Recommendation 4 is to think about providing multiple avenues for learning. Tends to be a lot of turnover at the SEA level within individual staff, and we have seen a lot of success in states that have actually funded an MTSS center that is adjacent to the SEA, so that when one person leaves the SEA, the institutional knowledge doesn't leave with it. Here, I've given you some examples of states that are doing that well. Think about aligning teacher and leader preparation with MTSS competencies. Coppin State University is actually in Baltimore, has recently signed on with NCII to do this as part of their 325M leadership grant that they recently received. And then offering online learning on core concepts. So again, I've offered a couple of examples of some libraries in Rhode Island and then through some of our national TA centers. And then the final recommendation, and then I will wrap up, is just to think about ways that you can remove barriers to implementation. Turnover happens, you have to plan for it. Think about ways that you can make implementation attainable and break it into steps. Think about if you're going to add something to schools or teachers' plates, such as assessments or intervention expectations. What are the things that you can take off of people's plates? What are assessments maybe that aren't necessary or redundant? What are the things what are the ways in which we will provide support? And then finally, what's the logic versus lore in your state? So there's very often conditions where somebody's lawyer told them 15 years ago that you have to have certain conditions in place to ever do an FBA, and then that becomes the lore of the state, even though it doesn't necessarily translate to what the law actually said. So you really want to dig into what are some of those common points of misconception that may be creating some unintended barriers to implementation if this is where you want to head. And with that, I will pause and leave it for any questions you may have. And I believe there was some guiding questions, but I think that at this stage, I was handing this back to the group, but I'm again more than happy to facilitate if needed.
Thank you so much. No, we appreciate it. And folks have a copy of the PowerPoint in their packet as well. Does anyone on the call have any questions, or anyone in the room? Dr. Badawi.
I don't know what this is on. I have a question about in some of the work that you have already done with implementing MTSS. One of the things that I could potentially see as a barrier is needing to address a culture shift, if you will, because at least what I hear from families and the interactions that I have with schools is that, well, if you need something extra, that's special education, right? Or you need a diagnosis, or I hear this all the time from families. So I think beyond training, there has to be a real culture shift, and I think that's probably what you're getting at with the lore versus law, but I also think it's bigger than that. There's going to be a lag time before, yeah.
Yep, I think you put it very well, and that's a great example of some of the common challenges is that some of those perspectives and perhaps what had been barriers in prior years or prior understandings of where in the district or school that they've been working in.
Mr. Hedelman?
Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca, it's nice to have you here. I greatly admire the work of you and your colleagues at AIR. And
Thank you.
And as you may know, I recently was in touch with them and wrote a nationally published piece that involves issues pertaining to basic questions. Why hasn't RTI been more widely and effectively implemented? And I think it's fair to say that no school system in the country, I know it's a strong statement, has implemented RTI, forget MTSS RTI, with fidelity effectively. So the question is, how do you go about doing it? There are barriers to doing it. But one of the things, and it goes to what, and maybe you guys are available to consult, but we have MTS RTI already embedded in several state laws. The Ready to Read Act, in effect, the blueprint plans for LEAs, and of course, SLD identification. And I wrote a memo on this that got to some of you yesterday, and maybe it can still be shared with all. So somebody needs to look at what have we learned, what's been done, what kind of technical assistance has been given, what kind of operational guides and PD, and what kind of monitoring has been done. Interestingly, in 2008, MSDE published an RTI manual that was super for its time and laid out a lot of the good things that you've put up as general principles. Of course, nobody did anything about it. It was never in any way implemented or followed up on. So I think a first job is to look at what's going on here, what's going well, what's not. Has anybody collected data? I can bet my life that there hasn't been uniform data collection, but has anybody collected data and analyzed that data? And what can we learn from what we're doing that, and maybe with the help of AIR, we can be a model state. As you may know, I've been in touch with Michigan, I think in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and I think Tennessee, and they're struggling with statewide implementation. But we can do better, and we should.
Yep, I think you put a lot of that very well, Buzzy. I agree with you on that. It is a challenging framework to implement, and I think that there's probably layers of reasons why it is as challenging as it is. Some of them being politically loaded, some of them being what we know from research. Certain areas we have a pretty good idea of what we should be doing. Others, I don't think it's as settled. And then a lot of confusion about roles and the interaction between things like general and special education, and what should the different teachers and specialists in this school be doing, and how do they see their jobs and their obligations. And so it's not an easy problem to solve, but I would say that's why I think it's really important to think of MTSS as a framework that has these pieces in it, and the pieces can be adjusted if what we're seeing is that they're not leading to the outcomes that we want. So, for example, in the area of reading, I think one of the challenges has been there's been very uneven core reading instruction going on in this country, even though people are doing core reading instruction, and probably some people think they're doing a pretty good job of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's translating to the literacy outcomes that we would hope for. So do we need to go back and think differently about what's happening in that core reading program for more schools? And then how do we think about getting the teachers the training and support they need to be able to do that reading instruction, both in-service teacher training, and also getting at Joan's comment in the chat is, how do we make sure they're getting that kind of training in their teacher preparation and making sure those things are aligned?
Yeah, I am
and
so
I think
sorry.
you could see it carry over.
I just also want to make sure that the comment in the chat is read completely, just for everyone's knowledge. So how could we engage IHEs in this effort to help teachers understand MTSS, as well as include in their training strategies and methodologies that are appropriate for Tier 2 instruction?
Well, one thing I would strongly recommend, and I don't know off the top of my head, but is that CEDAR, the OSEP funded center that is focused on teacher preparation, I think can be a great partner in helping to think about how to approach this and helping to design teacher preparation in a way that is aligned with these kinds of practices. But I would also say, some of these more organic things that are happening, and it just so happens that Coppin State signed on to work with NCII about a month ago, and we're thrilled about it because they are a newly funded OSEP training grant that is looking to redesign its preparation program to better align and create support teacher candidates to come out prepared to do the kinds of things that we're talking about within MTSS, conduct screening and validated progress monitoring assessment, understand how to individualize instructional programs, be able to evaluate interventions and ensure that they're appropriately aligned for students. So this is something that we are working to expand into, and to the extent that there are states that are interested in taking that on, I, as the director of the center, would love to have more of those conversations, and would be happy to connect you with folks at CEDAR. And I should have checked before I did this presentation today to know what your guys' history was with that center, but they do a lot of this work.
David, last question, but also want the group to know that the questions that Rebecca has posed here, you'll also have a chance to discuss in your small groups as well and continue this discussion. So, David.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? So my experience with MTSS seems to show that it's not so much the interventions that are the problem, but it's the expertise in delivering them. I mean, we're talking about a lot of general training solutions, but these require expert solutions in many cases, especially with some of the Tier 2 and Tier 3. So how do you get that kind of expertise in every single school and every single... that's one of the issues that I've seen with RTI and MTS, is that there's people that are just not available to implement the interventions, especially in reading and reading. Where a reading specialist is.
I'm not sure who was just speaking, but I think you are making a very important point, and I think that this is in our training and the way we think about the tiered systems is actually that Tier 2 level, or that secondary prevention level, can and should be validated intervention programs, that are often actually quite standardized in terms of their delivery, and many of them have been validated using people who are not necessarily trained teachers, but who maybe were research assistants, or who were paraeducators, or who were others who may approximate some of the other people that would be in the school building that aren't necessarily a certificated teacher, that can be trained up to deliver these interventions with fidelity. So it is possible. That being said, in a controlled study scenario, that's not the same as the moving pieces that are going on in a school building, and I absolutely understand and acknowledge that. But there are these package programs that are available where the training lift is less intensive than you might see on trying to perhaps train up an entire a school on a new core program or something of that nature. So where you could identify, you know, a core team of interventionists or paraeducators who'd be providing a tier 2, and that are a bit more easily transportable. But you're absolutely right that at that tier 3 or most intensive level, that's where those people with those really targeted instructional training can and should be stepping in. So whether that's reading interventionists, special educators, you know, people with intensive behavior support training, and others along those lines are the kind of people that you would hope could be made available to provide that tier 3 or most intensive level of service. And again, it all underscores the reason why you can't intervene your way out of a core program that's not working, right? That's not serving the needs of most kids. If the core program is not serving the needs of most kids, it is just not going to be feasible for most schools to provide the level of intervention that would be needed for all kids to make progress in a tier 2. So they really do, again, need to back out and think about what's happening in that core program and what potential additions to the core may be needed, in addition to thinking about how to work with these smaller groups of students.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for the information today. It's very, very valuable, and I think it will definitely help us to think about, okay, so what would a recommendation around MTSS need to be to move this forward? So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I know you'll be able to stay on, and we'll keep you in this room so that the small group in this room, you know, if they have questions, they can continue, but really appreciate your time.
Wonderful.
I want to transition and move us so that Nate can introduce himself to you all, tell you who he is. You can see, put his name in his face, and tell you how he's going to be able to support the work of this work group moving forward to help us come up with some real recommendations, right, that we can implement. So Nate, I'll give it to you, and then Carmen will help us get into our small groups.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Very excited to be with you. I will keep this brief because a big part of my role is to give you all more chance to talk, so I don't want to take up that time. Just wanted to touch very briefly on what is my role. Why am I here? First and foremost, let me say that I'm a neutral third party. I'm not trying to get you to create my plan or MSDE's plan. Really want it to be your plan. And my goal, and I think, is try to give voice to people. I think to help improve the process a bit, where there's more interaction and perhaps moving quicker or slower if need be. But we want to make sure that the folks who have committed a lot of time, and I know every person on this cares deeply, that we're hearing from all of you, that the expertise that you bring to this group is really factoring in. And I want to say nicely that I feel your pain. I did watch videos of the first few sessions, and I know everybody with the best of intentions. If I were one of you, I don't think we've heard from everybody. I don't think everybody's had a chance to share their expertise. And I'm hoping going forward, we can hear from everybody and benefit from all the knowledge in the room. I think there's one other role that I'd like to play, and I have facilitated a lot, probably 500 or 600 of these kinds of conversations through the years, is I would like to be a critical friend, meaning both a friend and both critical, to help you make sure that you are bold and yet practical. And we really want to make sure that we don't end up with a plan that sounds really good and yet isn't detailed or practical enough to actually get implemented. Because wouldn't that be the worst outcome, that we do all of this work and not enough changes on the ground? And I think today's discussion, and I really appreciated that the speaker really gets at, if we said, hey, we should do a lot of MTSS and it's the right thing to do and all kids are all kids, I mean, that is the right thing to do. But we need to acknowledge that that has been the message in the state and in other state, and it's not yet having the impact we want it to. So part of my job is to just help to push you probably to the next level of detail, the next level of practicality of how can we overcome these barriers. And because if we don't, we'll have a plan that can't be implemented, and that served nobody. I want to acknowledge that I'm still learning a lot about all of you and where this process has been. But I do think that there's already been some great ideas surfaced. I've read a lot of what you have shared and some of the memos and some of the recommendations. They seem very much aligned to best practice. And at the same time, it seems a relatively small number of voices have had a chance to weigh in. So as we go forward, we want to create some new systems and methods and let's face it, a Zoom meeting with some people in person and some people online, also a harder way for people to jump in. So we're going to create some systems and structures that gives voice to everybody. So that's my goal. Help you get where you want to go, give voice to folks, and to be a critical friend. I did want to share one last thing about my background. Who am I? Why did perhaps they ask me to help? I've approached this issue of how do you dramatically improve outcomes for kids with disabilities for about 30 years now. I have done it from a bunch of different perspectives. I have been a school superintendent. In the district I led, we did close the general ed special ed achievement gap. It's in our high school by 30 plus points. We reduced the number of struggling readers by 2/3. I have, as a consultant, worked with a few hundred districts, up to about 300 now, some of which, definitely not all of them, have dramatically moved the needle on achievement for kids with disabilities. Many of them have been able to dramatically improve the rates of inclusion. So I am a practitioner who has done this work. I've also helped, I have, in the last 15 years, probably spoken to 3,000 special educators across the country. So I think I can bring some of their voice, and I know we have some of them on this meeting in this group as well, to what gets in the way. I mean, I do believe general educators, special educators want to do the right thing more often than not, but there are things getting in their way, and hopefully my experience can help bring that. And I have worked with a number of state departments of education to think about and move to improve outcomes for kids with disabilities. And along the years, I've worked in 30 states, including with a number of districts here in Maryland. So this is not my first rodeo, but I still have a lot to learn from all of you. How we're going to move forward, two things that hopefully will feel different. We're going to spend much of the rest of today's session giving folks an opportunity to talk in small groups and then share their thinking. We're hoping electronically, folks can enter some of their thoughts so we hear from virtually everybody. So today we want to start hearing from more people. We also, Dr. Hickman and myself, both new to all of you, we're going to be offering over the next roughly 2 months an opportunity, not a requirement, but an opportunity to meet with us in small groups. And the goal of those meetings is really twofold. If you have very specific recommendations you want to make sure are considered, that would be an excellent opportunity. And again, I know some people have already submitted them, but I don't think we've heard from everybody. And if you have very specific recommendations on how to improve this process, we still have a lot of meetings and a lot of work to do. That's another avenue in a smaller group to share that. And anything else you want to share with us would be welcome to that. So that's kind of why I'm here, what I've done, how we're going to try to start getting more voice. Since I need to stop talking, I want to say one last thing. As we move into the small groups and we're talking about MTSS, if we can shift the conversation from, hey, is this a good idea? Because I think everybody here agrees it's a good idea. And if the conversation starts to shift, what's going to happen for implementation to be much, much better? Can we identify the obstacles? More importantly, can we identify the barriers and solutions to them? And particularly, how does MSDE help remove those barriers? That would be taking us to the next level. I do want to caution, if the answer is just professional development, I will tell you, as somebody who's been hired to do professional development, we have spent billions of dollars in this country doing professional development on MTSS. I don't believe there's probably a teacher in the state or in any state that hasn't had training on this. And I'm not saying training isn't helpful, but it doesn't seem to be enough. So what else is going to have to happen so that we can really do MTSS in Maryland as a model that's really moving the needle for kids? With that, I will stop talking and really look forward to learning from the experts we've got here today, which is all of you.
Thank you so much. So what we're going to do, Brian, if you can move us to the next slide, is now everybody in the work group will participate in one of 5 breakout sessions. You'll see these questions later on, so I'm not going to repeat them to you, but it's really an opportunity to have some discussions and really hopefully identify some high-level recommendations. Each breakout session, Brian, if you can change, each breakout session will have a small group with the same guided questions. There's a facilitator in each work group, and that is a member of this work group. In addition, there's a note taker and a timekeeper. They're MSDE staff so that we can maintain all the information. We do ask that you identify someone from each group to maintain a capture sheet to be able to report back to the large group on any themes or any specific recommendations that you have. So the membership of the breakout sessions is predetermined for those of you who are virtual. It's predetermined for those of you who are here also. I've told most of you where you will go. The few that I haven't told, I will make sure you know. For those of you attending virtually, you will automatically move through the miracle of Zoom. If you don't move, stay on. There are staff who will help you find your room. And just a note, if you require the sign language interpretation, please remain in this room because this main room is where the sign language interpreter will remain. So group number 1 will stay in this room. That is predominantly the advocates and some of the IHEs. Group number 2 will come with me to this room over here. Group number 3, Allison, raise your hand. Group number 3 will move with Allison Barmat to room number 1 on the 8th floor. Group number 4 will move to room number 2 with my friend Brian at the table to room number 2 on the 8th floor. And group number 5, Paige, will move with Paige to room number 3 on the 8th floor. All these rooms will be recorded and then will be available after the meeting. In your packet, you also have the guiding questions so that they will be put into the chat for those of you who are attending virtually, but this way the people in the room have the questions as well.
If I may, how much time is reserved?
Yep.
Because many of us had asked that there be specific issues on the table here today, like acting on recommendations, like dealing with time, like dealing with topics and guiding questions. How much time is set aside for that?
So what we'd like to do is move immediately to those breakout sessions, and folks will have 50 minutes and then come back.
So that leaves about 5 minutes. I want to strongly protest against an obvious, hopefully an inadvertent attempt to not respond to the various questions that have been raised that go to whether this work group is off track. I think we are owed a time to discuss that and not be prevented from doing that, and I suggest that at least 20 minutes be devoted to that.
I mean, I think that if we have small group discussions and don't have time to bring the results of those small group discussions back, and then we're not going to meet again as a group for 2 months. That's a long time to not have the discussion about the recommendations on the table.
Yeah, I didn't know we were coming back to discuss what the small groups discussed. I thought we were coming back to discuss what Buzzy had lifted up were some of the issues that he wanted to address.
And others.
But 5 minutes isn't going to be enough for that, right?
No, I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But that was my understanding, and that's the reason I think he's asking for that. So why don't we do this? So why don't we, and to honor what Buzzy's requested, let's go ahead and come back then by 20 of, be back in our seats. And then that'll give us some time, excuse me, very quickly for groups to, if there's anything key, but then the majority of the time should be spent talking about what was on the table.
Thank you very much.
David, you're with me in this room. You were someone I knew I had gotten to. I think you're staying here. Yep. If I didn't tell you. Yes. Yeah, Leslie. Absolutely. Right. You know what to do with parents. And early childhood.
I was going to stay in this room. Okay.
I don't know. I'm in a room by myself.
Are you moving us to our groups?
That's at board.
Hi, Beth.
Left a year.
I think
Villa.
you are supposed to be in a different group.
Waiting for someone to move us virtual people to be moved to the rooms. Who is moving them?
Are you IT people moving people to the rooms, Sean?
Oh, we're
So
still.
why don't we get started while they're moving the people to the rooms, because otherwise we're going to end up waiting for half hour.
Yes. Those folks.
And do we have virtual people that are in this space? I don't know.
I have no, I don't. Go ahead, speak up.
Well, I think maybe, hopefully you're getting ready to answer the question I was getting ready to ask.
I think the question do I still need this?
Yeah. It's on.
It is?
Yeah.
The question I'm going to answer is yes, there are people that are still joining us virtually. Right? They set up 4 different.
We had pre-assigned breakout rooms.
Yeah.
They didn't assign properly. I'm not sure why.
They've been notified where to go.
Okay.
It should take about 5 minutes.
They should know.
Okay. Well, then, okay.
Okay,
Can everybody hear me? Because the people that are virtual, so we are having to move some of these people by hand into those rooms. So even though you may not be there yet, I would go ahead with the small group discussions to at least get started, and know that the IT people are working to move you into those Zoom breakout rooms as we speak. So give it 5 minutes. If you're one of those that's being moved, and if you still have not been moved, then let us know.
So if I'm not following, then those folks that are in the virtual room for us here, we need to use the microphone.
Yes.
Correct? Okay. I just want to make sure for access.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Who's facilitating this session? Are you, Liz?
I guess I am.
Okay.
Yes, I guess I
Okay.
am.
Go.
Okay. All right. So we are going to dive in and
Slide 32.
slide.
The guiding questions.
The guiding questions. Okay. So we're going to,
Yes.
yeah. Okay. So we're going to start with thinking about specific recommendations that the work group should make on a range of possible options for MTSS implementation. And I mean, I would say I was interested in the article that Dr. Edmonds supplied as part of the pre-reading. This article that was looking at a nationwide analysis, and it really broke down the different sort of aspects of MTSS implementation and what is used in every state. And so that might be a way that we could structure the conversation about sort of what pieces we might recommend going forward for Maryland to incorporate into our implementation plan. But I'd love to hear what sort of initial reactions to what we've heard so far, and that reading in particular.
Can you all hear me? I also have posted the questions in the chat box for folks who are attending virtually.
Perfect.
So, and I'll full transparency, did not read it in depth, but I always vacillate on a list of improved interventions, right? I think they're great frameworks and ideas and thought provoking, but what sometimes happens, and so if we're just aware of it, is, oh, well, if it's not on this list, we can't do it, right? And I think we need to just be cautious about that, and then making sure, I mean, because the next question is, should special education instruction be provided within the tiers? Absolutely. If we have kids who have IEPs that need this and it works, then let's get it for them, right? So I think it could be a catch-22, but I think if we're aware of it, I think it also can be very helpful about what those different pieces can be.
I'll just say, since Mississippi's kind of called out here, the reason we found it was helpful, because what we found was happening in intervention was anything from, well, just take this kid over to the side of the room and read some words to them, or use flashcards, or whatever it was, and we thought that's really not getting at what we were trying to get people to focus on. So we went through the literature and the research and identified those research interventions that had efficacy attached to them in terms of student outcomes. And so that's the reason that we put that list on the website. So we said, here's where you should go first. Now, did every district absolutely require us? We never required them to do that, but people were asking, well, what should we be doing? And it's the same thing. It's like we were finding special ed children being pulled out of core instruction. No, special education is in addition to core instruction. So it's those kinds of things that I think that's the reason, that's kind of guidance that the state was giving, so that they at least had some place to go and not just think it was just a time to keep somebody occupied.
Absolutely. As long as at the end, again, the good data is collected, is whatever being picked that obviously is evidence-based, is it working?
Is it being monitored?
Right.
That's right.
Is it moving the needle, right? And getting measured, right?
And
Thank you.
It also does help. You know, I understand the limitations of lists, but it also helps with that consistency and fidelity as well. And, you know, I think you just need to figure out, how do you create a list, but then also say, like, this is not exhaustive. And
Correct.
If the data is telling you that there are problems, you know, maybe that's when you kick it up to the state, you know, or some more seasoned expert to come up with, well, here are some other strategies that could be tried and so forth, because there may be other, you know, ultimately promising or evidence-based practices that could start to emerge as well. And it allows that ability to capture some of that, but it also gives you the ability to not just sort of kick it aside or ignore it and be like, yeah, no, I followed the list and none of that worked.
None of that worked. And I don't know the answer to this question, but I'm assuming that Maryland does not have a list that's posted, at least for districts to look at.
I do not think so.
And I think one way of addressing the issue that Renee and Jade raised, without this becoming the sort of Wild West that we see in other areas like restraint seclusion and things that are really problematic when there's not a sort of a list, is that there can be a list with the approved things that actually the district should have to choose from. But if there's something else that they think would work, if MSDE had a process that was really easy and they could come to MSDE and say, hey, we found this thing that we think is effective, could you take a look? And MSDE could add it to the list. I think that keeps MSDE in control of this without districts just going off on their own and doing crazy things. I mean, maybe because I'm a lawyer in the room here, I just, our experience has been so challenging, I'll use that word, that I think MSDE needs to exert that leadership here.
Okay.
And
And
if
this
it's
is,
easy to
Nate-
add things, then having a list I think would be very helpful.
And if they're also identifying, oh, I'm so sorry.
There's somebody on the.
Sorry, this was Nate. If I could just jump into that conversation. One of the things I've heard from a lot of districts, I know the idea of the MSDE having the list. We find that a lot of districts want the list. Like, why does everybody have to figure out what works?
That's right.
Second, though,
Exactly right.
imagine something is on the list, which means it has worked elsewhere. You've tried it as a district. It's not working on a very large scale. You know, you might not want to go on to the next thing on the list because the problem might be how you're implementing it. And I think knowing that it has worked elsewhere and not working in, say, my district might actually be the mirror that I need to hold up and say that some of those systems that Rebecca was talking about might not be in place. So I think we want to be cautious about not churning through too many different options because sometimes that prevents us from actually addressing the root cause.
And I was just going to add that I think opening up sort of, you know, it's not on the list, but we don't have something that's working, and engaging in an interactive conversation with MSDE then also helps, because then maybe we pull in national experts or come up with ways to sort of say, okay, how do we help, so that it becomes a collaborative problem-solving process when they're hitting the wall and the list doesn't seem to be helping. And then you can go back and say, well, was it because, you know, the implementation didn't work, or are we in this place that nobody thought of or we haven't yet explored, but a kid's experiencing and has these needs, and that then becomes sort of a collaborative process to pull in the technical assistance to come up with solutions to then, well, let's try this, well, let's try that.
I don't think it's on. Punch it.
Okay.
There
okay.
you go.
It seems like there needs to be a substantial amount of technical assistance or monitoring, or both, from MSDE to help facilitate this process amongst districts.
I think just to echo that, but I want to point out the type of technical assistance can matter a lot as well. And one of the things that Rebecca shared multiple times, MTSS is a framework, which means it's a fairly high level concept. And I fear that a lot of teachers, like it's Monday morning, it's 10:30, I'm doing a tier 2 group. At that moment, I don't need a framework. I need some real help in knowing what's going to be effective for the kids in front of me for the next 30, 45 minutes. And I think that sometimes we start at the high level, which is the right place to start, but we don't get down to the level of specificity that actually makes it actionable at the classroom and teacher level.
Do you want to go to the next question?
Yes, we can. The one thing I wanted to just ask about was, you know, and Buzzy, I think, asked this question in an email that he sent, was about where the information came that got pulled for this research. And it would be so helpful to have a better idea of sort of what Maryland is really doing. And one of the things I'll just note is that, you know, they indicate in this research that Maryland is not including special education services. They're delivering
MTSS?
that it's out of the tiered system.
Okay.
And I don't know if
Okay.
that's the case, but
Okay.
it seems like we're all working with the assumption that that should be happening within
That's right.
special
That's right.
education. So I'll just flag that.
And the other thing I want to add, when we think about the barriers, you know, I've talked to nationally, so I can't say it's definitely in Maryland, but something you may want to find out. In interviews with 400 or 500 special ed directors, about half of them worry that it is illegal to have kids get tier 2 interventions who have an IEP. I mean, this is a very common theme. So, and I think trying to understand what are the obstacles, you know, whether it's, you know, district by district, what are the misunderstandings? I think Rebecca talked about logic versus lore. We find that there's a lot of lore that says all the things we want to have happen, people believe are not allowed. They may think they're good, but not legal.
Well, you bring up a good point, because I've been thinking also around the whole idea of communication, because I think that's going to be a critical piece. Whatever our recommendations are, however they're going to be framed, whoever it's going to impact, I think the communication has got to be very clear, because you're exactly right. I mean, in my career, I've had the exact same thing. We had a process in Mississippi that districts could apply for waivers of what they thought they needed waivers for. And they would send in things, and we're like, well, you can do that already. Like, you don't need a waiver for that. And so your point is well taken. Sometimes they just don't know what they don't know. Buzzy, you were going to say something.
Well, thank you. Am I on? Just to go back one thing, the Zhang article that we were sent is extraordinary. But they say, if you take Maryland, they say they got this information off the website, and I have researched Maryland, and I don't know where they got this stuff from. Okay. So as someone goes back and tries to figure out what we've got in Maryland and what we don't have, one needs to look at that. Another big piece of this is that by far the most effective Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention is tutoring. And there's all kinds of things, but nothing equals it in effectiveness. And so what we are talking about in terms of evidence-based best practices and is tutoring. And so once again, it's easy to get a list of abstract best practices in tutoring. Again, as part of the effort to look at what Maryland is doing in MTSS, one has to look at what Maryland is doing in tutoring. And once again, we have the TSI program under the blueprint. We have lots of tutoring money from ESSER. Does anybody know what's happened with that money? Who's doing what? And I will just also put in a surprising plug, as I wrote. The most nationally acclaimed Tier 2 program with tutoring in the country is in the city of Baltimore. It's the TSI program. It's one of the rare ones in which the tutoring is integrated into the RTI framework. It's a Tier 2 framework, and we ought to look, and I've worked with the program. There's an operational guide, and we should look to that.
Great. I'm also I see Dee, you've got your hand up, and I know it's hard to jump in sometimes from the Zoom world. Did you want to jump into this conversation?
I did want to say something.
You punch your button.
Sure. Am I able to speak now, or would you like for me to wait for someone in the room to finish?
No, why don't you speak, and then we'll go with Leslie.
Okay. All right. I wanted to respond after Nate's last comment with the barriers. I agree with everything that you've said, especially the part about the directors or the school systems at the top know what they're doing, but the problem is it filtering down to basically the people that are on the front line. And throughout these conversations, I believe that we've already identified the bottlenecks and what those barriers are. But the challenge has been up until now, either people feeling empowered to hold those barriers, either people accountable or to be empowered to actually remove the barriers. And that's one conversation that we haven't had. When we see those things, what tools do we have available to us to remove those barriers or to address those concerns head on? Because there's tons of information out there. Like you said, there's so much professional development. It becomes an issue of will at some point. So that's one thing that I would like to be addressed, the issue of accountability and tools available when we have identified what those barriers are. Thank you.
Great. I really appreciate that, Dee. And I think the one thing that I want to kind of put out there, maybe just in the sense of accountability. At least it's my sense that there are a lot of people who want to do this and do not have the control or authority. So I think of the teacher who wants to provide tier 2 intervention, but they don't control the schedule. And if there's no time in the schedule for it, or the speech therapist who knows that they should not pull a student from reading, but has to provide 2 times 30 a week, and the only time in their building is going to be during when Nate gets reading. So I think there's, to the extent there's a way to identify pretty concretely what are those barriers, so that we are helping remove those barriers, whether it's through policy or through technical assistance. But I like to approach this from the idea that the majority of teachers, principals, and district leaders would actually like to see RTI MTSS work. I am not sure that they all believe it is legal or right for kids with disabilities to get it. And I don't think that's out of meanness to them, but I think it's a lore that has evolved, that they get something different. But approaching this from what are the things that are getting in the way, and then how to remove them, might be helpful. Because I do think most people at this stage, not true 10 years ago, but at this stage, they know this is the right thing to do. But darn, we don't see a lot of it done or done well.
So the example that I was thinking about, I didn't want to make it seem like they were willful of not doing it. A barrier, you mentioned exactly what I was thinking about. Like the school that my youngest child goes to has an AIB schedule. So they don't have the same classes every single day. It's every other day. And so when we talk about these interventions and the best way that they work, if we're saying a child gets it 30 minutes every day, if this particular school doesn't have the same, if they don't have that same class every single day, this can't be implemented the same way at this school as it is at another school at the same grade level. So in order to remove that barrier, the barrier itself is the school day. So it's not.
Yeah, that you bring up a really good point. In fact, I made a note and my note was, we need to provide assistance to the LEAs regarding the master schedule development for implementation. And that is something that I think, unless you've been trained under a good principal, as an assistant principal, developing a master schedule is an art. And you have to develop it in such a way that you are blocking up that time and you're ensuring that interventions are provided outside of core instruction, not on top of core instruction, because then children are missing core instruction when they're being pulled out for intervention. So one of the things that I think we as a department should be doing is providing guidance around how do you develop a good master schedule at the elementary level, the middle level, and the high. Because some of your middle school...
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'm talking too much. But I just say both Vermont and Louisiana, when they rolled out their RTI efforts at the state level, they provided over 3 years of support around scheduling.
Yeah. And that's exactly right, because it's different when you're looking, because some of your middle schools have gone to 4x4s like your high schools have. Some of your high schools have 8-period days, some have a 7-period day, some have the AB schedule that she mentioned, and those master schedule developments need to reflect that too. Sorry, Leslie, sorry.
Thank you. There are 2 points that I want to make. The first is, in some ways, I feel like I'm living Groundhog Day. When RTI first began to be discussed, MSDE had put together an RTI work group, and many of us spent many, many, many hours
when
in
was
meetings.
That, Leslie?
I don't even remember how many years ago it was, but there was a work group. We spent many hours discussing these issues. There was a large handbook that was put out, distributed to all the local school systems. I mean, a lot of this work was previously done and is probably available. So it's in some ways really frustrating to me to feel like we're recreating the wheel. MSDE already has done a lot of this work on the RTI piece. There's already been work groups on positive behavior supports. Like, a lot of this has already been done. And I feel like we're sitting here as if we have to start over again. And that's really frustrating. I would really encourage you to try to figure out if that report got shredded, if it still exists. I mean, I don't know, but it makes me feel like I've spent hours and hours of my time traveling to MSDE convened meetings only to have that work just disappear. The second point I want to make is, Nate, you made a reference before about how technical assistance and training doesn't always work well. And I think, just bearing in mind the context that people do not call Disability Rights Maryland when they're happy about how things are going with their kids, and I make that point a lot. I think that there is also a barrier here, which is a hearts and minds one, which is that it is really important that every teacher and every staff person recognize that all children belong to them. It's not these kids and those kids, right? If MTSS is going to work, then every staff person has to take ownership of all the kids that are in front of them, because otherwise it is doomed to not work. So that I think is a really critical, I think it's a really critical point.
I agree completely. Any suggestions from the group live or in the Zoom world still? Because I agree completely. We've got to move the hearts and minds. I'm curious whether folks at this point have suggestions on how one goes about doing that. Because I do think like you can put out, even if we find the old manuals, what do they say? It's like seeds on cement. If people aren't even thinking, why are you giving this to me? It doesn't relate to me. So I'm curious for thoughts on how do we move the hearts and minds? Because I do think that's a critical component.
Go ahead, Buzzy, and then we'll go to Dr.
Well, very quickly, Leslie, I mentioned the 2008 manual that is still around and available online. And as I said, it was excellent, but nobody did anything with it. In response to your question, Nate, I think the biggest barrier of all has not been mentioned, and that is money. It costs money, and the main reason why schools don't try to implement MTS-RTI is because it takes staff time and money, and I think we have to be realistic about that. The money, the TSI money in the blueprint is grossly inadequate. We have one of our topics will be funding, and this plays into that. It also goes to the fact that in the real world, we ain't going to have big bundles of money soon, and all the more important is that hopefully we will prioritize K 1, 2, 3 for MTSS RTI. One other thing I want to add, and the problem with resistance, there's been a lot of resistance to RTI from parents in other states mainly, because they feel that the requirement of RTI before referral is being abused to prevent referrals. And so a very clear, job of the state is to ensure that hasn't happened. I don't know whether it's, pardon?
I was going to say anyway. Yeah, I mean, Leslie was saying that they've got a manual. It's very clear. OSEP issued a dear colleague letter on it, the guidance on it. Right. So, but I think that's back to that list, right? That's where I sometimes think parents do struggle or families do struggle, and I think that the piece that helps with this hearts and minds that Leslie was talking about, because we do want all of our children to belong. And parents don't call Parents Place of Maryland when they're happy either. I wish they did, but they don't. The reality is I think the basis of this, besides the fiscal piece that's a barrier, is that there really is not authentic and genuine family engagement around this. And if we're not partnering with families from the get-go with all of this, then we're not going to make any progress with any of it. I mean, we're going to make some progress, but if we really want this to work, we've got to do that at the beginning.
And you got to build that sense of trust.
So, yeah. So we only have about 3 minutes. Let's have Dr. Billman and then I have one comment.
Sure. Yeah, I really love the way this conversation is evolving. I was just thinking from a teacher preparation standpoint, really ensuring that we're starting to include not just special education in these conversations around reaching all of our learners, and really including the general education teachers and teacher preparation programs as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully I was talking loud enough.
I got it.
And so I do think that there are some steps being implemented within the blueprint, but how can we further consider this in future teacher prep programs?
So we didn't actually I didn't actually read out the question, but I think as we were talking, we really got to talking about barriers, and I think that's important, and Nate held that up. And I would just point out that one thing I think, one way to get at the hearts and minds thing, and is also thinking a little bit about the barriers, is creating conditions where, teachers are effective and where people feel success and they see success because we've created the conditions on the ground where they can, right? In some ways, I don't want to spend a lot of time working on hearts and minds one teacher at a time or one principal at a time. We've been trying that for 40 years, and I feel like that's what got us to where we are today. That if we create structures, service delivery models, staffing plans, that work, that where interventions can be delivered effectively, teachers are going, hearts and minds will shift as they see progress, as they see kids, gaining the skills and knowledge that they need. So that's sort of my thought about that. Do we have any final thoughts? We have maybe 30 seconds left.
I have a thought, if I can speak. I've been listening to this meeting for the last couple of months. So here's my thought. I'm a principal at a building of 720 kids. It's a 100% poverty school. I like to say I live in the real world, and I'm in the trenches every single day. Here's what we don't need. We're talking about barriers. Here, I want to say this as nice as possible. Federal government, state government, there are barriers. Everything that we're talking about from a principal perspective is going to interfere with reading, math, social studies, science, Encore, RTI, intervention, special ed, meetings, et cetera, et cetera. What we need at the school level is clear guidance from MSDE that is clear and in timely, because I deal with a lot of special ed things, and we're waiting for months to get answers back from MSDE and never get them. There lies in the problem. So this group has been talking for the last couple months. We adopted CKLA, which was recommended, one of the recommendations from the state. That itself gets in the way of half the interventions I used to do a year and a half ago, just because the way it rolls out, and to do it with fidelity interferes with a lot of other things that we used to do to help kids. So the one thing I am looking for, and I think would be important for the entire state, since every school is different and every child is different, that what counties can do versus what they can't do. I think we're all educators. I think we operate very well in little squares. Tell us what we can do and what we can't.
Recording in progress.
Because what I find is that I get mixed messages all the time. At this point, I have 1 hour a day I can do interventions for all kids. Right now, where 2 years ago, I could have used double that amount of time. So because we're following the rules, now we have less time to work with kids. That makes no sense to me. So my 2 cents is that we have to come up and develop a way that it's clear, concise, not overly burdensome. Because right now, MTSS is caused a lot more paperwork on our end, but it's not really helping kids. That's what I can tell you from a school level. And I think that's not what we want to do in this group. So I just let the flood of emotions come out.
Appreciate that.
Downstairs and make sure everybody's on the way.
Okay.
But I think everybody's been moved back, right? So that should have been a pretty clear message.
Okay.
May I ask a quick question before we?
Sure. Please. Yeah.
In the recommendations, there was something in the. Oh, sorry.
And make sure you're on. Yeah.
In the recommendations, there was something in the first sentence that said the special ed funds were meant to be spent on 504 students. And I was surprised. Maybe I misunderstood what that was saying there.
What recommendations are you talking about?
The very beginning of that, I felt like it was one of the first things I saw in the recommendations, or in one of the narratives that we received.
Well, the special, in Where's my special ed friends? Here we are, Dr. Hickman, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that the federal law still provides 15% of all special ed dollars that can be spent on general ed children. So, and knowing that 504, the first place you have to go to be even identified as 504 is having a disability, even if it may not impact you in such a way that you need special education services. So that could be the reason that that's stated that way. Probably needs some clarity to it. Am I right about that, Dr. Hickman?
Yes, you were referring to, yes.
Yeah.
In accordance to 2004, that was 15% had to be set aside for MTSS.
And I don't believe that's changed. No.
Great. So a question for, I'm not sure who, because I think we've got two things we wanted to do and 15 minutes to do them. One is, I know there's some just wanting to talk about the process and issues to date. And I know we also wanted to hear from folks from the other small groups. So I think above my pay grade, at least for my first meeting, I had to decide which of those two things we're going to do. I definitely want to apologize, and I know we did not get everybody into the small groups as quickly or fully. So we'll definitely want to work on that logistics for our next meeting. But how do we want to use the last 15 minutes?
I think it would be helpful. I know we are crunched for time, but we were hoping that each group could provide at least two, but maybe we'll do one, at least one key takeaway or recommendation that your group talked about. Just
got
one
5
recommendation, because we have 5 minutes, and then we can get into the discussion that Buzzy raised that Nate will help us facilitate. Maybe if we can get
20 minutes ago, we seemed to be promised 20 minutes. We're already down to 15 minutes. Is there an agreement that we will extend beyond 6 p.m. to have a reasonable time to discuss the issue of concerns about getting the work group
I guess
back
the
on
question
track, or
is,
do you want to run out the
hear
clock?
Do you want to hear from each of the groups is the question, or do we want to spend the last 15 minutes that we have addressing the concerns that were put on the table?
I'm wondering if we could take like 15 seconds, at least for folks who are on Zoom, maybe to put in the chat if we were to focus on, just I'm curious, both seem really important. So I'm just curious. And I know it's very hard for folks in Zoom to often weigh in, but you can put in the chat if you had a preference for doing some sharing out, talking about the issues, or trying to do some of both. Maybe give you 15 seconds if you want to jump into the chat with a response.
Can we see the chat?
Can you monitor the chat, because I can't see the chat?
Yep, I'm looking at it.
And Molly's monitoring right here as well. Kendi would like to hear what the group said.
Just make sure you're on it.
I don't know. Is it on now?
Yeah.
Like our group lost 4 members because we couldn't get them in, which is part of the process problem we're discussing. So I think we had a good discussion with who we had.
Yeah.
But reporting out is reporting out a partial finding because we lost half of our group because the process is problematic.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Let's not waste time sort of figuring out.
Yeah.
Let's just dive in and spend a few minutes talking about the process. Is that okay? Okay. Okay. Do you want to go ahead, Buzzy?
Thank you. I think a bunch of us are concerned about how we move a listserv, or staff anybody can send an email to Carmen Brown as the traffic controller, and she will automatically distribute that to all members. When we talk about participation, there's no better participation than for people to read and write and do their homework and comment. And that has been missing in this process. So can we reach an agreement that there will immediately people can exchange emails?
Yeah, we're able to do that. We're able to do it, either put together a listserv or a distribution list.
Or even in the interim, Carmen could do it.
Right, that's what I meant by distribution list, because
Okay.
you said email her and she can distribute
Right.
that.
And
May I real quick? Sorry. We have to figure out a way that we can do it that still meets the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. So if we're just sending emails back and forth or responding to Buzzy's emails, then we these are subject to the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. So we have to figure
Brian,
that out.
I've been a state official too. That's hooey. And we have to find a way to get things done. And you can always find somebody somewhere that you can't exchange emails because of the open meetings law. I'd like to see that opinion in writing.
Okay,
That's
rather
the kind
than
of thing
rather than
we're
us
up
debating
against.
that right now, why don't we put a pin in that, and then let's get back to, and we'll get back to you on exactly what AGs have to say about that.
And the second thing I would want to request is that we finally get a schedule of topics and guiding questions through the end of the year. Liz prepared such a thing a long time ago. We don't have it.
Okay.
And there's no way, unless we plan, we're going to have trouble getting this work completed by December of 24 anyway. So it seems to me no later than 2 weeks, a list of proposed topics and guiding questions should be sent to all members, and they can be discussed in listening sessions or people can comment, and that be acted upon at the next meeting.
What do you mean acted upon?
One bit of pushback.
That we implement that schedule, unless there's reason to change it, but that we finally have a schedule. We don't have a schedule. Why?
And if we had that, I mean, the reason why I've wanted that from the beginning is so that people could then, whatever your area of particular expertise is, you could be pulling together research. You could be writing a brief, like Buzzy's written a couple of things, to bring to the group so that we could really take advantage of the unbelievable expertise that we have in this group. So, but if you don't know what's coming, 3 months from now, you don't know what the question's going to be, it's really hard for you to kind of dig in. And you may look at that list and say, actually, the question should be written like this.
And the only thing I want to add, though, is I think having the list makes sense. Having visibility for the rest of the year makes sense. But I also want to make sure that as we are putting together what are the topics and guiding questions, that we have a way of getting input from virtually everybody who wants to give input.
I said that.
Yeah.
I said that it be distributed and people can comment, and then it can be approved or disapproved at the next meeting. So
I think we're saying the same thing. Did you have?
Okay.
Okay. What was your next comment, Buzzy?
Hopefully, we will be able to act on a few recommendations that have been on the table for a long time, and that call for no more than what MSDE should be doing anyway, which is develop its items 1 and 2 from the first meeting, and item 1 from the second meeting. We'll develop a comprehensive literacy plan within X number of days, and then there'll be plenty of time for MSD to work on that and submit it, and we can all send in ideas, this and that. But there's no reason for MSDE not to get to work.
And we're not debating that for sure. Let me read what those are so that everybody knows what he's referring to. This came out of the September meeting. If you've got your notes or in front of you, it says COMAR and MSDE guidance should be revised to explicitly provide: 1, students without significant cognitive disabilities are legally entitled to IEP goals and services that enable them to meet grade level standards. When these students are behind in grade level standards, they should receive IEP goals and services that enable them to close or narrow the gap between standards and their performance levels. 2, students with significant cognitive disabilities are legally entitled to IEP goals and services that enable them to have access to grade level content standards, in other words, the general ed curriculum, and to meet alternate grade level standards. Goals should be based on evidence-based instructional practices, related services, and LRE principles. And then the number, I guess is, well, I'm going to make this one 3, even though it's 2 on the page. Review state monitoring tools and compliance protocols to ensure that IEP goals narrow or close the gap between present levels of achievement and grade level standards, and that, based upon research and professional judgment, IEP services are reasonably calculated to enable the goals to be achieved. And the last one had to do, this came out in November 1 and today. A comprehensive early literacy plan. MSDE should develop a comprehensive early literacy plan to ensure that all students in general ed receive evidence-based instruction, including high-dosage tutoring within an MTSS RTI framework in general education with the highest priorities in grades K through 3. Those were the recommendations that he is putting forth that we start addressing.
And I hope it's understood. Dr. Wright, I know you've been here a month, and
Right.
I couldn't be happier.
Let me repeat that.
I
5 weeks.
I couldn't be happier. Well, unfortunately, you're
Yeah.
up against the revolution of rising expectations, but I will try to behave. And so it's your plan. We're just saying, because we didn't know that you would be here when we
I
did
didn't
this.
either 5 weeks ago. No.
So, I don't know how anybody can be against this. With respect to the standards, those other two, that's what the law requires.
It does. You're exactly
And
right.
so there's no reason why staff can't be working on regulations subject to input, your judgment, and the board's.
But some of that is just foundational. I mean, going back to the hearts and minds conversation, right? Just
mhm.
making sure everybody's clear on what it is that
On
we're
the
what we're
expectations.
trying to achieve.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. I'm good.
Okay. Does anybody have anything they want to chat? Yeah. Go ahead, Dr. Badawi.
I just have, I don't know if this is on, but I
It's
just
on now.
have a question about, I see these as parallel but not completely overlapping. The one goal to have an MTSS framework with universal tiered interventions and to decrease inappropriate IEP referrals, but then also looking at the current implementation of IEPs and special education
Totally
services.
agree. Totally agree.
So I know our focus seems right now to be the MTSS framework. So are we looking at down the road to address current special education?
Yeah, I think that's, I think MTSS was simply because it was the topic of the evening, not the overriding, everything that goes on with special ed. Because I do think it's important to refresh people's memories that these are to be expected, in IEP goals for children, whether they have significant cognitive disabilities or they don't. So I think that looking at both at the same time is a really good idea.
Liz, maybe you can, my recollection is that exactly what you framed is one of our topics that's been on the pending list.
I think one of the things that'll be coming up pretty soon will be a meeting that also is about the integration of general and special education, but really where one of those answers is around MTSS. Another framework is UDL, and thinking about how do we make sure that all students, that we're teaching to the predictable variability in every classroom, and that kids are able to get all of their services.
That would go to specially designed instruction
right,
in IEPs, and I would hope, in other words, the way the question is framed for next time, it seems to me it's a repeat of what we've discussed the last 2 times. And that we should move on to another basic question that digs
Well,
into.
what we'll do is put together the list of topics and, in the proposed timeline along with that, and then it'll give people an opportunity to respond and say, we're good with this, or we'd like to add something else, or can you substitute this for this? So the entire group will have an opportunity to provide feedback on that.
Great.
And I think another thing we might want to do between now and the next meeting is, and I know we didn't get to hear from everybody from the breakouts. I know people have an opportunity to connect with me and Dr. Hickman, so maybe we can, if people in those meetings want to share some of their thoughts as well on this. But I think coming back to the group, so we don't just move on to another topic, and I know we can't linger on this one forever either, but maybe if we came back to you with hey, here's what we heard, and here are some options for how MSDE might move forward on the MTSS question. Just as, for folks in room 1, the question of should there be a couple recommended programs or not? Should scheduling be part of MSDE's focus when it comes to helping to implement? That next level of detail, I think would be so much more helpful than just saying, hey, go do MTSS.
Yeah.
That was very helpful 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, for example, most states do not get involved in scheduling. But maybe
No,
what
and
came out of-
don't misunderstand. I'm not going to dictate master schedules. That I wouldn't, having been a principal for a number of years, I wouldn't have appreciated somebody doing that to me. But what we can do, and what, in fact, what we did in Mississippi, we put out a whole document on best practices around developing master schedules. And if a principal wanted to use it, they could use it. And if they didn't, they were on their own. But at least we gave them something to start with.
That's what I meant.
Yep, absolutely. We've got about 5 minutes, so we probably need to. Do you want to talk about the next steps in terms of the listening sessions that are going to be going on? Yeah, Nate's going to do that? Okay. Nate, next steps and resources.
Okay, so as I said, I'm still new in learning. Dr. Hickman's new. We will be reaching out to folks between now and our next meeting. It's an offer, not a requirement, in relatively small groups to meet with us. Primary goals of those meetings is if you've got specific recommendations that you want to be bringing forward, we definitely want to hear them. If you've got other ideas on how to improve the process, we want to hear them, or anything else you think we should know to make this work more successful. So we will reach out and give you some times to connect. It'll all be virtual. And if the times we shared just don't work, I won't speak for Dr. Hickman. We'll be very flexible and find a time that does work for you. I don't want scheduling to get in the way. And I think as we talk about the next meeting, what I can definitely promise is we will spend the next 2 months working on the technology and some of these processes to make sure we can get the small groups working a little smoother, make sure we've got the time tighter so that when we do the small groups, we can also share out. I want to say this is a step in the right direction, but we didn't really do everything I'd hoped we could in this today's meeting. So we'll spend some time fine tuning that. And I think since we've said that we will share a draft of what would be the agendas for future meetings, and then get feedback from all of you, and then bring kind of the compilation of what the future agendas could look like to our next meeting. Did I miss anything else?
No, I think you covered it.
Great, well,
thank you.
Really appreciate everybody's energy and appreciate your patience as we work out the best way to do this important work.
Yeah, let me just say that I want to just double down on that. I really do appreciate everybody being here and everybody's thoughts. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I've been involved with special ed, and Allison can tell you, since my days, even before I got to Montgomery County and was in Howard County. But it's important for us to make sure that our kids are learning. And I can look at the data like you can look at the data and realize that we've got a lot of work to do. And just know that our hearts and minds are in the right spot. And we're going to move forward with all due diligence and really do the best that we can to make it can be done. We've done it before, and it requires a lot of focus and a lot of implementation pieces that go with it, but we can get there. And I honestly believe that. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't tell you that. So let's just hang in there as a group, and keep on coming back. We appreciate it. Thank you.